There might be times that you are going to create the function, but you will not know straight away how many arguments this function may need to accept. Let's quickly have a look at one of the examples and how we can actually tackle this sort of situation. I'm going to create the named function, so function, and then the name of the function will be merge with array. And I am not going to pass any arguments through to this function by default. Inside of this function, I'm going to create arguments variable, and what I'm going to do is to associate whatever the function func underscore get args is going to return. And let's quickly have a look at the documentation for this function. So copy the name of the function, go to our browser, php.net. In a search, we are going to paste the name of this function. And what it does, it returns an array comprising a function's argument list. And if we scroll down, it says that it gets an array of the function's argument list, which means it takes all of the argument that we are going pass through to this function, and it will return them as an array, basically. So as it says here, returns an array in which each element is a copy of the corresponding member of the current user-defined function's argument list. So if we go back to our editor, and what I'm going to do now is simply return arguments. We could obviously return this function straight away, but later on I want to do a few other bits and pieces here, basically. So for now, let's just basically return whatever we get through this function, basically what sort of arguments we are going to get when we actually pass some arguments. So what I'm going to do is use var dump function, and inside of this function, I'm simply going to call this merge with array. And I just need to put semicolon at the end of this var dump statement. And now I'm going to pass in some arguments. I can put them in line, or I can again create the new line and pass them through this way. First of all, I'm going to put one array with just one item, so some string, basically. We can do it like this. Obviously, again, you can create new line if you want to have more items, less, whatever else, basically you can do whichever way you like. As you may remember, PHP doesn't care about spaces as long as they are not inside of the string. Okay, so we have one array as the first argument. Then let's put just as another string, some name as the second argument, and let's put the number, let's say 1, 2, 3 as the third argument. So we've got three arguments we are passing to this merge with array. So the first one is the array with 2 items. Then we have a string as a second one, and we have an integer as a third argument. If we save it and preview it in a browser, if we go to our course dev, php course.dev, and there we go. There's our array with 3 items. The first item at index 0 is the array with 2 items, and these items are at index 0, we have string with 4 characters, which is some. At index 1, we have string with 4 characters, which is less. The second item in this array is the string with 9 characters, which is this some name. And then we have at the third index, basically, which is indicated by index 2. As you may remember, arrays start from 0, so we have 0, 1, and 2, which means index 2 will indicate that as a third item in the array, and that's just an integer, which is basically 1, 2, 3. So as you can see, what this func get args has returned is exactly what we passed in as arguments when we called this function, and we didn't have to hard code these arguments here because we didn't know how many we will pass through. So sometimes there are situations where this is going to come in pretty handy. So what I'm going to do now, because we have this first array here, what I would like to do is to merge the other two and put them inside of this array. So what I'm going to do is basically, first of all, I'm going to check if is underscore array, and what I'm checking here for is I'm going to check if the first argument in this arguments array is of the array type. So I'm checking if it is an array, and I'm going to use arguments and index 0. This means that the first item in this array arguments array, if it's an array, then curly brackets, and what I'm going to do is basically create the new array variable, and what I'm going to do is array underscore shift to take this value, this first item from this array, and shorten this original arguments array by 1. So I'm passing the arguments through as an argument. So now this first value has been associated with this array, and this arguments array is now shorted by this first argument. And now what I'm going to do is simply return array underscore merge, and I'm merging the first argument which we pass through to this function, which is basically now stored inside of this array a variable, which is of an array type. That's why I'm merging this one, plus whatever's left inside of this argument. In other words, these two, we are now become part of this first array. Basically, we are merging these two arrays together. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is simply return this argument. So if the first item is not an array, then return the arguments, because the arguments, all of the items basically will be just as a single array. So if we save it, we don't have to, as you can see, I'm not doing else statement, and this is something you should start getting used to as well. Try to avoid multiple or else statements when they are not necessary. As you can see here, we've used return. So once we've used this return statement, nothing else from this function will be executed. This is the end of the function. At the end of this statement, that's it. This return is never going to be executed. So we don't need this else statement. We only check if, return it, that's it. If this isn't going to evaluate to true, then we know nothing from this, from within these two curly brackets is going to be executed, in which case it's going to straight away go to this line and return the value, the value which would otherwise be in the else statement. But because we are returning, we don't need to use the else statement here. Basically, so if we save it and preview it in a browser, go to the browser, refresh the page, and there we go. Now you can see we have one array. We don't have embedded array inside of it. We don't have this sum and less inside of another array. It's just simply 0, 1, 2, and 3 index. All these items are in one array because we've merged the first one with the remaining two arguments we passed through. It might be a little bit confusing, but try and slow down basically. I know I might be rushing a little bit. So if you feel that it's a little bit too fast, try to pause the video, go back and look at the code again. I'm sure it's going to make sense. So just to recapture, here we are checking if argument at index 0 is an array. And index 0 will be this first item that we are passing. This is 0 index, this is index 1, and this is index 2 for the third item. So we're checking if this argument 0, because this func get args puts all of these items into array. Basically, this is the first item in the array, second item in the array, and third item in the array. At 0 index, we have this array, basically this first argument. If this one is an array, and we know it is because we obviously have it here as an array, then what we want to do, cut it off from this array, take it out of this array, assign it to this variable, and now what we can do is using this array merge two arrays together. So the other two are still inside of these arguments after this array shift. But this first one is no longer inside of this one. It's associated with this array. So we are now associating this array with these two items, which are now stored, as you know, in the side of this arguments array. So these two arrays are now becoming one. This is what we saw obviously as a result. Let's now remove all this code and have a look at another example. This time what we are going to do is actually pass the arguments together with a callback function. And what we will do is basically use the arguments which we are passing. We want these arguments to be used inside of the callback functions. I'm just going to show you basically with the example. So let's try and define a new function, which we are going to call pass all arguments to callback. Pretty long name, but hey, there we go. And what I'm going to expect this function to accept, what will be required of this for whoever's calling this function to pass through, is going to be a callable basically argument. So callback, we are going to call it, and then two curly brackets. So basically whatever we are passing through as an argument, and it's a mandatory argument. As you can see, we haven't associated any default null value or any other value. So they have to, whenever you call this function, you have to pass the callable. It may be a named function, maybe the anonymous function. It may be even class method basically of the class, but don't worry about this. That's not part of the procedural PHP programming, which is what we are discussing within this first series. But it has to be something that we can call. So inside of this function, what I'm going to do is to use this argument. And remember, you can obviously call this variable whatever you want. I'm just calling it what it actually is. Func get args again. So we are fetching whatever arguments are passed through to this function. And it doesn't have to be just one. It can be more than just one. We are requiring one. We are declaring hard coding one. We're making sure that this one is definitely going to be passed. If there's any more, that's fine. We are going to collect it with this func get args call. And now what we are going to do is return call underscore user func, which we've used before, but then array. And what this one does, it allows us to, first of all, first argument, pass the first argument, which is basically the callable, of the type callable, which again, it may be a function, anonymous function, it may be a named function, it also may be a method of the class. And then we can pass arguments which we want to pass to this function which we want to execute. So let's say if this named function requires any arguments, we can pass them through as a second argument, and they have to be of the array type. That's why this underscore array. If we just copy the name of this function and preview it, see actually the documentation at php.net. If we just paste it inside of the search box, and there we go. Call user func array call a callback with an array of parameters. So basically, I think that says it all basically. So if we go back to the editor, now we can pass whatever we've collected, but because all these arguments that we pass through, which we might have passed through, apart from this callback, are now inside of this arguments array. But don't forget, this func get args will also collect this callback. So the first item will be this callback. So what we need to do is first of all remove this callback, because we don't want to put the function which we are calling into as an argument to this function. Basically, that wouldn't make much sense, obviously. So what we want to do is pass anything that might have been passed to this call, to the call to this function, apart from this first argument, which is actually the callback itself. So what we are going to do, we could obviously do it on another line and then pass it as an argument, as a variable associated with the variable, but we can do it straight away here as a second argument. So what we're going to do is use the array underscore splice, and we are going to pass the arguments, and then we say basically cut the first element off and return everything that's after the first argument. So I'm going to pass the just number 1 as the second argument, saying start from the index 1 rather than 0, because at index 0 we have this callback function and I don't want this, so return everything that's inside of this argument starting from index 1. So that's what it does. Okay, so we know now what this function does. Now what we need to do is let's create the anonymous function but associated with the variable. Let's say concatenate name equals and function, and we are going to have first name argument and then the last name argument. And then set of curly brackets. Again, this time we need a semicolon at the end because we are associating, because this is anonymous function and we are associating this function with the variable. This is the association. That's why, remember, we need the semicolon at the end. Okay, inside of this closure, we are going to simply return first name, and then we're going to concatenate this, so full stop and single quote space, creating this string space basically between the two, and then concatenate it again with the full stop with the last name argument. That's all we're going to do. Basically, put first name, last name, and that's going to join them all together with the space in between. And now if we go lower down the line and we simply echo pass, we're going to make call to this pass all arguments to callback. And now we know that we have to pass the callable as a first argument. So what we're going to do, use this concatenate name variable function. And now if we want to pass number of arguments, we can do it. And we know this concatenate name later on will be called from this pass all arguments to callback, and whatever additional arguments we are going to pass through will be passed to this callback. So basically we know we need 2 arguments here. So let's put these 2 in. I'm going to put Sebastian, and then third argument will be Sulinski. So once again, what's going to happen now? When we are calling this function requires the callback, which we are passing by simply using this variable closure here. So we've got this required argument, and now these are optional. Obviously, they are not optional for this closure, so we definitely have to pass them, but they are optional to this function. This function is not aware of these 2 arguments. It's only aware of this first one and requires this first one, this callable type of the argument. And then we are making call to this callback function by using this call user func array, and it's array because we are passing the array as the second argument, which contains the remaining arguments that we are passing through. So it's this Sebastian Sulinski, basically 2 items, which will now become an array because we use this func get args, and we set throw away the first argument because the first argument is the function which we're actually calling, and only use array the remaining items in this array, which are obviously this second and third argument which we pass through. So basically what we did, we're calling this function from within this pass all arguments to callback, and we are passing these 2 arguments to this function by using this call user func array and passing these remaining arguments as a second argument. So if we now save it and preview it in the browser, and if we go to phpcourse.dev, refresh the page, and voila, there we go. That's my name, and it's simply being displayed by calling this pass all arguments to callback.